I had finished my homework before I went to bed. He had already eaten breakfast when I woke up. They had left the party before I arrived. She had studied for the test before the teacher gave it. The car had broken down before we reached the gas station. The sun had set before we reached the summit. He had already left by the time we got there. She had learned how to play the guitar before she started singing. They had already seen the movie before I suggested it. We had already booked the hotel before we arrived. The store had closed by the time we got there. He had already finished his project before the deadline. They had been married for 10 years, before they had their first child. The doctor had already seen the patient before we arrived. She had cooked dinner before he came home. We had visited that museum before. He had already made a reservation before we decided to go. They had played soccer before they tried basketball. The concert had already started when we got there. She had traveled to Europe before she went to Asia. We had already taken the dog for a walk before the rain started. He had completed the puzzle before he went to bed. They had lived in New York before they moved to Los Angeles. She had written the book before it was published. The train had already left by the time we got to the station. He had already met her parents before they got engaged. They had saved enough money before they bought the house. She had received the email before she saw the text. We had already seen that movie before we went to the cinema. The store had already sold out of that product before we got there. He had already read the book before he saw the movie. They had already started cooking before we arrived. She had finished the race before anyone else. We had already visited that city before. The restaurant had already closed when we got there. He had already graduated before he got the job. They had already started decorating before the party. She had already packed before he asked her to. We had already reserved the seats before the show started. The plane had already taken off by the time we got to the airport. He had already written the letter before he mailed it. They had already started the meeting before we got there. She had already picked out her outfit before the party. We had already seen the sunrise before we went to bed. The game had already started when we got there. He had already bought the tickets before he invited us. They had already made the decision before they consulted us. She had already cleaned the house before the guests arrived. We had already taken the test before the teacher announced the review. The project had already been completed before the deadline.